Hey folks, for the last 9 months or so my main build has been in a budget mATX case, which was perfectly fine when the CPU was the Pentium G3258, but now that we've upgraded to the Ryzen 7 1700 and we've got the RX 480 in there, it's just not really cutting the mustard. Looks a little bit boring, feels a little bit cheap, and just lacks that special something. Enter the STYX mATX case from RAIJINTEK. This is a case that features brushed aluminium, or aluminum if you're in the States, and comes in a number of colours, and even for a micro ATX case it's incredibly compact, and the quality and the materials used throughout, it belays the price tag. At the time of recording, this case is available for about £70 on Overclockers UK and about $84 on newegg.com, but there will be links in the description below for you to check out the latest pricing in your area, and there's often certain colours that are on sale at various times. So what do you get for your money from an aesthetic standpoint? Well, the build quality is very nice. Overall, for a £70 aluminium case, the panel alignment is spot on, and that thick front panel is a real highlight and feels much more premium than the price suggests. The side panels, while being constructed from thinner aluminium, still feel really sturdy, and there's little to no flex unlike most of the thin steel chassis at this price point. There's easy access to the front I/O atop the panel chassis, and here we can find the twin USB 3 ports and the standard assortment of audio jacks. The power button, it does have a nice feel to it and it gives a satisfying click when pressed. Removing the side panels is as simple as unscrewing 4 screws. It's hardly a difficult procedure, but when we become used to thumb screws it does feel a little bit fiddly. A hinged door system would be well suited to a case of this calibre, but it would equally add more complexity and cost. And to be perfectly honest, once you've done your building and the panel is screwed back on, the screws sit nice and flush, and they do add a nice little design detail to that solid aluminium panel. On the roof of the case there's a large mesh section, and this doubles up as a kind of dust filter. Unfortunately, removal of this requires you to open up the case and unclip it. Still, it provides a useful intake for the GPU to get a good constant stream of cool fresh air, but it should be noted that the mesh is black regardless of which colour you choose, and it stands out from the rest of the brushed aluminium chassis in the colour variants. But this is just one minor aesthetic niggle, and it's completely subjective. The mesh panel itself is extremely well constructed, it's not flimsy in the slightest, and sits well with the high quality of the rest of the case. Beneath this mesh panelling we can find a pair of empty 120mm fan mounts, which also doubles up as the room for 240mm radiators. I've got the windowed version of the case, which attracts a very small premium depending on where you buy from, and the window is located around the CPU cooler area. You can purchase a windowless version if you do not have a CPU cooler that you want to show off, although for our Ryzen Spire CPU cooler it looks like it'll be framed nicely in that window. Looking at the back reveals an upside down motherboard orientation, hence why the window is on the right side of the case. The STYX has 5 expansion slots, so you can use a dual GPU setup. There's also a nice plastic clip at the end of the PCI bracket cover. Again, a nice touch and something that just adds to the notion that this is not your bog standard quality mATX case. Looking through that window we can see that the STYX is fitted with one 120mm standard RAIJINTEK exhaust fan, and flipping the case upside down reveals rubberized feet, which helps raise the case a little and improves airflow. On the bottom we can also find a large cutout for the front mounted PSU, and even just taking these small points into consideration in isolation, it's clear that this is not going to be your standard build. The weight of the case comes in at under 4 kilograms and measures 210mm wide, about 360mm deep and 335mm high. Now let's take a look at what we're going to be trying to squeeze into this case. We're going to be transferring my full Ryzen 7 system, so that includes the XFX RX 480, one SATA 3 SSD, one M.2 SSD which is already installed on the B350 motherboard, an EVGA non-modular power supply, a 3.5 inch 2TB hard disk drive, and a 500GB backup drive if we can manage to get it in. We're also going to be adding 2 120mm cooling fans, which I intend to use to draw cool air from the top of the case over the GPU, in addition to the pre-installed RAIJINTEK fan. When it comes to the power supply, RAIJINTEK recommends having the fan facing into the chassis, acting as a sort of secondary exhaust. This does make most sense, as it would be useless trying to suck air in through that front panel, because it's completely closed off. This does mean that if you're using a tower cooler, you might be pulling air in 2 different directions. Thankfully, we shouldn't be seeing that problem at all with the Wraithspire cooler, as the heat dissipation here is omnidirectional. The PSU fits in really easily and is connected through a pass-through cable which reroutes the external connector to the rear of the case. Cable tidying's never easy in cases with these kind of dimensions, but there are two main routing holes beside the PSU and a fairly large cutaway section across the top of the motherboard tray. There's no rubber grommets to speak of, but there are a few hooks behind the motherboard tray and a hole at the bottom for the 12-volt cable. At the back we get about half an inch of space to play with between the back of the tray and the side panel, so flattening out the PSU cables as much as you can would be recommended here. So although this case takes a full ATX power supply, if you've got a smaller or modular PSU, you're probably going to find building in the case a lot easier. And the space above the PSU is going to be generally used for stashing those excess cables. You're not going to be blocking any airflow here, and even with a standard ATX PSU like I'm using here, the non-modular version, there's enough space to keep the cables away and everything tidy. And this is probably one of the most impressive things. It's a good design consideration and it opens the door up for any of you that are simply wanting to transfer your existing components, perhaps from a larger case like I was using, into a smaller form factor. Looking on the motherboard tray, you can see the pre-installed motherboard mounts. To the side we've got black sleeved cables and a cutout on that tray to help with the installation of CPU coolers. Like with any case of this size, I would advise that you try and mount as much things to the motherboard before installation. And also, before you do that, you're going to want to install any of the rear mounted SSDs prior to fitting the motherboard, as the screw holes are going to become inaccessible once the motherboard's been installed. If you wanted, you could use a sticky pad to help keep it in place, but when you're dropping down a case of this size, it's always advisable to plan ahead and build a sort of roadmap before screwing everything into place. Once your SSDs are in and the cables routed, installation of the motherboard is the same as any other mATX case, and even those dreaded front panel connectors are no trickier to install than you're going to be used to. Even with a full-size PSU, the case supports 280mm long GPUs, and my RX 480 fits in here no problem with ample room above and below to ensure good airflow. And that's even with the two 120mm fans installed. With everything connected up in a quick test fire, and bingo, everything is as it seems. This impressive level of hardware support doesn't end there. Despite its small size, the STYX has a fair number of options for internal storage. On top of the two dedicated 2.5-inch mounting brackets behind the motherboard, we've got a cross brace that was stripped off earlier, and this can play host to two 3.5-inch or 2.5-inch drives, or it can be removed altogether if you're not going to use it. On top of that, there is a final 3.5 or 2.5-inch mount on the case floor, and it should be noted that all 3.5-inch locations have noise suppressing anti-vibration grommets, which is a really nice touch. With my somewhat poor cable management, I did struggle to fit that second 3.5-inch hard drive, due to my RX 480's braided 8-pin power connector, so I'll have to drop the backup 500GB drive for this build. I should note though there were no issues when trying to install another SSD in that location, and with a combination of a modular PSU, better cable management, or even a different GPU installed, you might not ever even come across this issue. Liquid cooling is supported, as I briefly mentioned, and although I don't use it myself, you're likely going to be limited to all-in-one coolers. There is support for 120mm radiators in the rear, and the roof mounts will support 240mm radiators if you want. If you're going to be using an SLI or crossfire setup, however, you won't have much room to play with when it comes to all-in-one water cooling, unless you go down to really slimline fans. So with all these components squeezed inside, the cables routed as best as I possibly can, and their test boot up working fine, it's time to screw everything back together, which is just a case of a reversal of how you dismantled it, and when that's done, bingo, you've got a very compact, powerful gaming PC, and it still looks absolutely fantastic. So overall building in this case, it was really nice, unusual, but nice. Any minor niggles that I had or experienced would be completely preventable with better component choices, which you can address if you're building from scratch, but on the whole, it was a really nice case to build in. The quality of materials that are used here, and the fit and finish of the panels, they're just a huge step up from what I was using. And that all aluminium construction, it just really sets off the look of the case. And booting up the system for the first time with that Ryzen Spire cooler glowing red through that square window, I think I finally have a case which fits the performance under the hood. But I'm sure you're going to be asking, does it come at the cost of noise and temperature? Well, surprisingly no. Since the case is ever so slightly wider than the standard mATX affair, airflow seems to be much better than I'd anticipated. Just like my previous case, all 3 fans are being controlled by the motherboard and set to an unobtrusive profile, and even running through a stress test in 3D Mark, the temperatures remain, well, pretty much in the same range as I'd experienced with the much larger case. So premium looks, premium feel, high-end performance and a bargain price. What more could you actually want? If you're on the lookout for something that's a little bit different, something smaller than the usual micro ATX affair, and you want to have something look a little bit more special than the usual painted steel chassis, then take a look at the STYX. I've been hugely impressed by how much you can actually squeeze into the case, and even more impressed with the performance of it. The fact that the window frames that Ryzen cooler so perfectly, it's just the icing on the cake for me. But folks, I'm going to sign off there. I really need to clean the rest of my office just to try and make it look as good as this STYX case. Anyway folks, use those thumb buttons and the subscribe button for more content like this. Take care, and I'll see you down in the comment section and in the next video.